Got it. Well, I'll click on got it. Right.
Got it. What does that mean?
That we understand that it's being recorded.
Oh, do we? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I've also made you a co-host already, Mark.
Thank you.
So
Are there any more coming in, John?
not at the moment, but we're
We're
only
up.
1 minute past 8.
Yes. So we're up to 33. Mm.
That's good.
I think you may as well start, Mary. And
Okay.
what
Righto. Well,
what
I've got
I'll
mine.
do, if I may, is I will now mute everybody.
Yes.
Otherwise,
Except
we'll
Mary.
hear
Yeah.
TVs and everything in the background. But that will mean you have to unmute yourself again. Okay?
Me? Yes.
You will have to
Well-
unmute yourself, yes.
Can everybody hear me? No. Good.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So here goes. Anyway, the person you can see top left is John Reed, who is our facilitator in this. And he's the one who can mute us. My name is Mary Billow, and I'm president of the Channel Islands Family History Society. So I've got a little spiel to do first. And I was told to remind everyone that all this is being recorded, when John's already told us that. So I want to welcome you to this Zoom meeting, and I'm sure everything will go all right. And before I introduce Mark, I do want to remind local people of our outdoor meeting in July, Monday, July the 26th, start time 7 o'clock. And we're going to convene at St. Martin's Roman Catholic Church to visit the cemetery and hopefully also get into the church. And Georgia Lemaitre has been doing quite a bit of research on those buried there. So that's Monday, July the 26th, start time 7 o'clock. Anyway, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mark, who is top right with a background to St. Clement. And I told you all about him in the MailChimp message, but I'll just repeat 2 points. He's a member of the Family History Society, so obviously that's the first point. And he received a knighthood in the birthday honours in June 2017. And I'll quote the citation: formerly chairman, Policy and Resources Committee, City of London Corporation, services to the finance industry and to local government in London. And he holds quite a portfolio of public and private sector positions. I'm only going to draw your attention to one, which particularly relates to the UK, serving as chairman of Link Schemes Holdings Limited, which runs the UK ATM network. Some of us call it hole in the wall money. And where would we be without it? And you should also go and visit his website, which no doubt will be on one of his slides, www.boliat.com, which gives a great deal of information about him and his publications. Anyway, he's going to give us a Zoom talk tonight on migration from Jersey to New Zealand, particularly in the 1870s. And I think if he's ready to go, John, shall I will mute myself, shall I?
Please do so, yes. And Mark can then unmute and take control, hopefully.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be doing this talk. You may wonder, why on earth should somebody wish to study migration from Jersey to New Zealand in the 1870s? I have 2 reasons. One is family history. I have some relatives who were part of that migration, and it's how I first got to know about it. And secondly, Jersey's population and immigration and emigration are my favorite subject, on which I've already written a number of papers. So the two came together in doing this, this talk. So a few key points. Quite large numbers, I reckon over 500 people emigrated from Jersey to New Zealand in the 1870s. And that reflected conditions in Jersey at the time, and it reflected policy in New Zealand. So having a look at that in a bit more detail, I'm an economist by training. I've studied immigration and emigration, and generally migration happens because of what we call the push and the pull factors. People move from one jurisdiction to another because there are factors that make them want to leave where they are, and there are factors that make them want to go to where they're going. And looking back at Jersey history, you can see how that has happened over many centuries. So my great-grandfather migrated from Brittany to Jersey in 1875 to dig potatoes. And he probably earned 5 times as much doing that as he would have done as an agricultural laborer in France. But it's not just sufficient that somebody should want to go somewhere else to earn more money. There's also got to be the attraction of where they're going to. And Jersey wanted people to dig potatoes in the 1870s. Jersey people weren't going to dig potatoes, so they got people to come from France. And we can see that now in Jersey with Polish immigration over the last 10 years. People in Poland saw the opportunity to earn much more money in Jersey. Jersey needed to get people who were going to do the jobs that were not going to be done by local people. So that applies to all forms of migration. So let's go back to the 1870s. Why did lots of people move from Jersey to New Zealand? Well, Jersey was going through a pretty rough time in the 1870s. There'd been a huge boom from 1820 to 1850, the population doubling. And it all went wrong in the second half of the year, the century. By 1870, the population had fallen 5%. The cod fishing industry was declining at a rapid rate. The oyster fishing industry had almost disappeared. Cider wasn't what it used to be. So people were losing their jobs. Incomes were lower. People were thinking, surely I can do better somewhere else. So lots of people wanted to leave Jersey. But why New Zealand? Well, New Zealand was a young country, really been settled only earlier in the century. There were battles between the settlers and the Maori. New Zealand wanted bluntly white people to increase the size of the white population. So there were reasons for leaving Jersey. There were reasons for being in New Zealand. But people in Jersey weren't just going to jump on a boat and go there. And New Zealand heavily subsidized the package. And finally, I'm going to mention something called the herd factor. Now, I've mentioned there's quite a big Polish community in Jersey. There's quite a big Latvian community in Guernsey. There is not a big Guernsey Polish community or a big Jersey Latvian community. And why is that? Well, I suspect what happened with the Poles is that some were originally employed to work in agriculture or tourism. The people employing them found they were pretty good. They wanted some more and said, do you have any friends in Poland or Latvia? And that's why more came from Poland to Jersey and Latvia to Guernsey. So for some reason, there was a bit of momentum behind this move. And I calculate that about 5 times many people went from Jersey to New Zealand as from England for the size of the population. So a rate that was very much higher. So a bit about the marketing. There was a big operation run from London to get people all over Britain to go to New Zealand. Local agents were employed And they had sub-agents, people like shopkeepers, clergymen, anybody. And there was advertising. I put on the screen the advertisement. If you can't read it, I'll quickly run through it. Free passage granted by the government of New Zealand as under to married and single agricultural labourers, navvies, ploughmen, shepherds, mechanics, also to single female domestic servants as cooks, housemaids, nurses, general servants, and dairymaids. So that advertisement appeared in quite a number of newspapers. They also used social media. They didn't have Facebook or Twitter, but there was an attempt to get people who'd gone to New Zealand to write back saying what a wonderful place it was. And let me read a letter that was in the Jersey Independent and Daily Telegraph on the 23rd of May, 1874. A letter has been received in Jersey from H.N. Lachlan, New Zealand immigrant, and it has been handed to us with a request for publication. The letter dates from Port Chalmers, Otago, New Zealand, and states that the immigrants by the ship Mongol arrived safe on the preceding day, after a pleasant passage of 51 days, having left Plymouth 2 days before Christmas, and making one of the quickest passages on record. During the voyage, 1 man and 15 children died. That's just a sort of odd comment to make in the middle of this letter. The letter goes on to say that the ship was then lying in quarantine, after which they would proceed to Wellington. Persons come alongside the ship and offer £2.15 a week and all provisions found for harvest workers. The writer's humble opinion is that New Zealand is the most beautiful place in all the world, and appeals to all his friends to follow his example, concluding in the following glowing terms: the country is the finest in the world, the produce the largest, the wages the best, the position is the cheapest, the climate the mildest. In fact, I cannot speak too highly of the people. They all seem glad to see us amongst them and offer us a hearty welcome. Now, I suspect our friend Mr. Lebrun might have influenced that letter, perhaps, but it's an example of marketing that happened at the time. I'll come on to the Mongol later because it was not quite as was presented there. So that's the sort of marketing. You'll see at the bottom of the advertisement a Mr. Lebrun, who lived at 5 Clare Street near All Saints Church in the Parade. He was one of the main agents in Jersey. He was a rather odd sort of chap. He was a school teacher, then he ran a sort of a small retailer, but an interesting person who took a keen interest in all things nautical. There was a second big agent, a Mr. Garrick, but he seemed to come from England, but he was very active in recruiting Jersey people to go to New Zealand. So the people were recruited in Jersey. They got the boat to Southampton. They got the train up to London. A few actually went to Plymouth, but most of them went from London. In fact, the ships all sailed from Gravesend. They then had a crossing. 50 days was good. 90 days was more typical. They were housed on arrival, and they were then sought after by employers. So a few pictures. The Adamant. This was a migrant boat. I've no idea if there's any Jersey people on it, but it's a good picture that I extracted from a museum in New Zealand. It left Gravesend on the 6th of May, 1874 for Nelson, and there were 10 Jersey people on board that particular boat. This is the barracks in Napier, and this is where some of the people who arrived in Napier would have been housed immediately they got off the boat. I actually visited, not the barracks, they're no longer there, but that bit of Napier, because that's where a couple of my relatives spent their first few days in New Zealand. And it's to those barracks that the local employers would have gone and sought out people with the skills that they wanted. The sailings were dangerous. You heard that wonderful letter about how smooth the passage was. This was not typical. They were dangerous and they were deeply unpleasant. They've been well documented by Augustus Sampson. Augustus Sampson is my great-grand uncle. Now, some of the older ones amongst you, and looking at the pictures, quite a few of you seem fairly old. You will remember the firm of A.P. Sampson in Harket Place, which delivered your paraffin and sold you dustbins. Well, that's all part of the Sampson family. But Augustus Sampson didn't like Jersey, couldn't get a job, but he was a sea captain. And he wrote a log of his journey to New Zealand, which I extracted from the National Library of New Zealand, who could not have been more helpful. And I've typed it up and it's on my website. But it's a really good account of what the voyage was really like, particularly the very rough seas that they encountered once they got into the southern oceans. I want to mention one particular sailing, the Scimitar in 1874. Now, we heard in that letter from the man on the Mongol that 15 children died. They died of scarlet fever. And the 26 who died of scarlet fever, 26 who died on the Scimitar all died of scarlet fever. And this was caused by a Jerseyman, a Jersey family, a Mr. Wolfrey in particular. And what happened is that the Wolfrey family wanted to emigrate. They traveled to Plymouth in their particular case. And I think they discovered while they were there that perhaps they had the local equivalent of COVID-19, i.e. They had scarlet fever. And I'm going to quote from the Royal Commission on the subject. It appears that the parents of the child Wolfrey, who was subsequently sent ashore, had, while on the depot, been consulting a chemist in Plymouth, a fact they had carefully concealed for fear of being left behind. While the health of the immigrants generally was good at the time of embarkation, it is equally clear that epidemic disease was latent, if not in active existence, in the depot. In the case of the child Wolfrey, there is every reason to believe that she was infected on arrival there. So the Wolfreys were chucked off the boat or the depot, not allowed to travel, but the Scimitar did travel and 25 people died as a result of being infected by the Wolfrey family with scarlet fever. And the Mongol, which you heard about earlier, had 15 deaths. Now, Mr. Wolfrey was nothing if not persistent. He went to London, changed his name modestly changed his first name, got on another boat, went to New Zealand and settled there. And I mention all of this because I'm delighted that we have on the call a descendant of Mr. Wolfrey, who contacted me just a week or so ago. But that was one of the more interesting people who emigrated. There was a bigger disaster that cost Patrick. This left England in September 1874 with 476 crew and passengers, including about 30 people with Jersey connections. It caught fire off the Cape of Good Hope and sank. And almost everybody died, and it was quite horrific. About 80 people were managed to get to lifeboats, but the lifeboats themselves ran into trouble. There was clearly cannibalism. People went mad, they died of hunger, and eventually only 3 people survived. So it is regarded as one of the worst New Zealand peacetime disasters. And there were on that boat, as I've said, over 20 people with Jersey connections. Some established Jersey families, some people who'd been there only for a time. And in doing research, I discovered that money was donated for a memorial at the Almora Cemetery. I went to find it and completely failed. John Knoll kindly went and found it very quickly. And it's just behind the chapel. That's a picture of it. Thank you very much for that, John. Unfortunately, you can't read the inscriptions, but that is a memorial to 20 or so people in Jersey who died on the Cospatrick. So a bit more about who the migrants were. They were young. Most of them were under 30. There were some very large families. A couple of names that will be very familiar. We've got Delahaye, Longois, Le Masrier, and I'm going to mention here one family, again, because somebody on the call is connected with it, the Jarvis family. And this was a John Jarvis, age 40, married, a rope maker, his wife Hannah, née Meda, and 8 children. So they were among the families that made that crossing. On the same crossing was a George Millo, a single blacksmith. And there's a Millo I see on the call. And I've had, again, some correspondence from a descendant of the Millos. And I'm happy to say that George Millo married Hannah Jarvis. So a couple of Jersey families, they clearly met on the boat and got married, and I hope lived happily ever after. They were mainly from St Helier. They were certainly working class. These were not entrepreneurs. These were not professional people. Quite a lot of young single men, and there were 12 single girls from the orphanage in Grouville. This became the Jersey Home for Girls, and it's now Clos de l'Église. And this was a Reverend Lesueur who seemed to gather up young Jersey girls and send them to all parts of the world. So he sent 12 to New Zealand, including one as young as 11. So these were the migrants. So what was the effect of these Jersey migrants on New Zealand? Well, that's blank for a reason. I don't think they had much impact. They were not entrepreneurs. They were not professional people. They were laborers, working class people. While many of their descendants have undoubtedly had a big impact on New Zealand, the immigrants themselves, those who went there, did not. And that's in pretty sharp contrast to what we saw, say, in Canada and in America. But there were some prominent migrants. I'm going to cheat a little and go back to some who were not part of the 1873 to 1875 migration, but some of the more entrepreneurial people who went earlier on. And I'm going to pick the most prominent, John Helier Vautier. And I say that because I had the pleasure of having lunch with one of his descendants, Noel Vautier, who's written a splendid book about his great-grandfather, Noel Helier Vautier, who was a great man in Napier. He was the mayor of Napier. He was into shipping. He was a coal merchant, and he was responsible for building of the breakwater. He's got some very eminent descendants, including Maxwell Helier Vautier, who's was a justice of the High Court of New Zealand, and today Noel Helier Vautier himself. Another of the early immigrants was Edward Bartley. He went there in 1854. He was a builder. He became an architect, apparently very influential. There's about 20 churches he designed in New Zealand, and his influence was felt more widely. Ellen Ann Hewitt is interesting, maiden name Baker. She went to New Zealand, married a Mr. Hewitt, and they had an eventful time. They were burnt out twice by the Maori, and her husband was killed. She went back to England, but eventually came back to New Zealand and did a lot of work with the Maori. And she's written a wonderful book on her experience that is been reprinted 6 times. And it's a really good example of what the early settlers in New Zealand, how they lived, what they had to face. And I'm going to finish up with 2 of my relatives, Augustus and Charles Sampson. Now, I mentioned Augustus Sampson, he who wrote the voyage, his manual of the voyage, his log. Now, he was an interesting character. He was the second oldest of 16 children. and he didn't like his father very much. He ran away to sea, became a ship's captain, and he decided to emigrate to New Zealand, as I've explained earlier. And he settled in Napier. So when I was doing the research for this paper, I went through Keith Vautier's magnificent database and I found another Samson, a Charles Samson. I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder if he's related. And I discovered that this Charles Samson was indeed the younger brother of Augustus Samson. I think there were about 14 children and 14 years between them, but they were brothers. And Charles Samson went a year after Augustus. He was only 16 at the time. He traveled as a single young man. And he also settled in Napier. Indeed, having been to Napier, I think the two lived probably less than a mile apart. Interestingly, I'm not certain they knew of each other's existence. In the diary of Augustus Samson, presented by, I think it was his grandson, there was no mention of meeting with Charles Samson. And it's possible they did not know about each other, perhaps even in Jersey, given that they were two of 16 children many years apart, and Augustus may well have left home before Charles was even born. So that's just a curiosity. That's just about my own family. So that's roughly run through what I wanted to say, but let me just finish with their impact on Jersey. And again, they didn't have much of an impact on New Zealand, and they didn't have much of an impact on Jersey. You know, I've gone through all the literature on this, gone through Chambers of Commerce records, and other people have helped me looking at research. And, you know, were they missed? Did people say this is terrible? And I've picked out this little article from a newspaper. Roughly in English, it says, emigration fever is still strong. And on Saturday, a number of Jersey residents embarked to seek their fortune in New Zealand. Others, we are assured, will follow them very soon. We wish them all the best possible success, but we are very much concerned that many may regret leaving for the Antipodes, Jersey, where they may not have made a fortune, but where they could have lived in relative ease working. So finally, a few words of thanks and where there's some more information. The paper is on my website, boliat.com. Pretty amateur presentation by me. I'm getting it printed properly by Roger Ladad Jones, and that'll be available soon, but the text is there now. And there's also a paper on the passage of Augustus Samson for those who want to know really what the passage was like. Thanks to many people, I've mentioned several already, but particularly Keith Vautier, who I hope is on the call. Indeed, I think he is. He has compiled a superb database of people from Jersey who went to Australia and New Zealand. Without that brilliant piece of work, I could not have done this research. And it was a great pleasure to meet Keith and Vivian when I was in New Zealand, and to have lunch with them and with Noel Vautier at St Heliers Bay in Auckland. We could not have found anywhere better. So that's my presentation. I hope you have found it interesting. I hope people have got a few things to add to it, or even to subtract from it, to correct what I've said. And I look forward to hearing what people have to say and to the discussion. Thank you.
Right, John.
I was going to ask Mark if he could stop sharing his screen, then.
I'm trying.
Right, don't worry.
I've stopped the video. I'll endeavour to stop sharing the screen.
Oh,
Perfect.
Right, now how do you want to control the questions, John?
Well, I think
Do we just
everybody's,
people put up their hands or what?
if they use the reactions button on the bottom line, then they will,
Yes.
we'll call
Right.
them up in order and ask Mark to answer their questions.
Right.
Maz,
Oh,
Yeah,
here we
Maz.
go.
Yep.
Got somebody?
Hi.
Hi,
Um,
Maz.
hi, my great grandfather didn't migrate in these big migrations. However, he descends from the Lamosier family. And so I was wondering whether or not there is any other information you'll be able to share about that family and maybe who migrated over. Because our biggest issue is, whilst we're based in New Zealand, we are quite a far away from Jersey and don't have any direct ability to kind of research anything. And so all we can really discover is what's online. So I'd really love to be able to see if there's any more information you can share.
There's a lot more information now about Jersey that people can look at. If you go back a few years ago, the records were not online. So now all the birth, marriage and death records are online, and the census information. So if you've got the name, I'd be very happy to have a look at what I can find. And Keith Bautier's database may well have information on the passage.
Awesome, thank you so much.
But if you just go to my website and send me a note, I'll see what I can find.
Perfect, thank you.
I think Marie-Louise had a question. You typed something in, Marie-Louise.
I did. Well, it was just curious. I just wondered, do we have any records of people returning?
That's a good question. I was meant to cover that myself, because normally if a lot of people emigrate, some people decide they wish they hadn't and they want to come back. So what I did was try to look at the 1881 census to see whether anybody had come back. And the answer looks like only a handful. Now, there can be two reasons for this. First, they love New Zealand. Secondly, they couldn't afford to come back. And I suspect it could have been a mixture of the two. New Zealand offered free passage from England to New Zealand, but not from New Zealand to England. So I think the only people who traveled to and from were the, what I might call the professional people. Certainly if people had, traveled without many resources, they were manual laborers, they did not have the ability to come back. So the answer to that question, I think, is very few.
Mark,
Got
we
any
haven't
idea about their literacy?
I don't know, but I suspect if I look in the census, not all of them were literate.
Yeah, right, okay. And Mr. Lockwood had a question, I think.
He does, and delighted to see Mr. Lockwood, who I've corresponded with in the last couple of days. We do know what ship the Wolfrey family went to in New Zealand, and it's one that sadly I can't pronounce. But I've got it. The Ballochmyle, Balocchmyle, and they left on the 4th of March, 1874.
Thank you, Mark. That's fantastic.
And you are a descendant of Mr. Wolfrey, I believe.
Yes, please don't hold it against me.
Well, I'm delighted you've been able to join us, and we were able to make that contact just in time for this meeting. I know
it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's 5:30 in the morning here in Australia, but I'm glad I could make it on the call, so it's great.
Well, thank you very much. And the Wolfrey thing is the subject of an entire Royal Commission report. So it was clearly regarded as pretty much a major, disaster at the time. And it wasn't the only one. And there was actually possibly another Jersey family involved, but the name was Smith. And I've no idea if that was the Smith from Jersey or the Smith from somewhere else.
Thank you, Mark.
Here's another one.
From the US?
Yes.
Yes, hi, Jamie Poindexter here, and I've been researching a Poindexter that ended up in New Zealand. So I'm kind of curious, is Keith's database online, or is it something you need to contact him directly to look up?
Yeah, I'm delighted to have a Poindexter, or Poindexter as we call them in Jersey. And indeed, there is another one on the line because that's my cousin Rosie.
My cousin as well.
My database has a Susan Poindexter, age 19. That's from Keith's database. But that is the one source which is available online. If Keith is on the call, he can come in and tell us about it. But that is the source that I have used for all the research I've done.
Mm-hmm. The one I'm looking for is Charles Edward Grant Poindexter, who was born in 1862, and I don't know if he immigrated during this time period that you're focusing on with his parents or what. I don't have that kind of detail. Okay. And this is because we do the Poindexter Descendants Association. We do research when people inquire about anything Poindexter, and so this gentleman that is from Australia today, but New Zealand before his ancestry is asking us these questions about his great-grandfather, Charles Edward Grant Poindexter.
Okay. Keith's database is great, but it covers people who are from Jersey, according to what's on the ship's record. And quite a few of those actually had only been in Jersey for a short time, and some of the Jersey people, some genuine Jersey people actually were recorded as being from London. But Keith, I can see you. Perhaps you can tell us more about the database. Can you unmute, Keith?
How's that? Finally, I hit the right button. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We can hear you very crackly. And again, thanks very much for all your work, which is what my research has been based on.
Great. Okay. I decided many years ago that I needed to know more about migrants to New Zealand and started collecting them. It's become a bit of an intermittent project these days, but you can find it simply by Googling keithspages.com and you bore your way into the little section on Channel Islands. You'll find that there's probably about 1,200 names there. They cover the whole period prior to 1900 in general, and they cover migration to both Australia and New Zealand. I can't say, without having it in front of me, who has got relevance this morning, tonight here, I'll get that right. But yes, you're certainly most welcome to correspond if you've got ideas on names that aren't there or more information about some that are. Of the names on the list, I do keep a portfolio, if you like, on some of them as a means of further information.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks very much, Keith. And again, I think we all owe a huge debt of gratitude to you because this is a huge bit of work you've done, and it's the basis for a lot of people to do research. And it was a great pleasure meeting you and Vivian and Noel in New Zealand and that wonderful lunch we had in St Heliers Bay. But again, the database, it doesn't get everybody from Jersey. Mr. Wolfe managed to miss it second time round because he recorded himself as being from London. And some of the people in the Jersey database, because I checked them all back to the 1861 census, and quite a few were not in that census. So they could have been people from Ireland or from England who've gone to Jersey to work, found that Jersey wasn't everything it was cracked up to be, and they decided to try somewhere else. But there are many hundreds true Jersey people who were part of that migration.
I saw Mr. Gustin had a question.
Yeah, I was wondering how many current CIFHS members do we have with email addresses in New Zealand?
Do we know that?
Stuart, no. Stuart, our membership secretary, might have a guess at that.
Well,
I have the answer, but not readily available.
I mean, is it 10 or 20 or?
I would be making a guess. I really don't know.
Right, okay.
Interestingly, I wrote an article which I sent to the New Zealand Society of Genealogists, hoping they'd publish it. I haven't had a response, about how to trace ancestors from Jersey. Because I've said until a few years ago, the information really wasn't easily available. Well, now, thanks to the work of Jersey Archive and Ancestry, there's a lot more that is available. So I've done an article that I hope they might get round to publishing it. I'm also doing some work at present on the Jersey Identity Project. And one of the points I'm making there is that, you know, Jersey's got a huge diaspora around the world. Many people, I think, would be keen to know a little bit more about the island they or their ancestors came from. And, you know, I've identified a few prominent people. And one I keep mentioning is John Kerry.
Yeah.
For those of you who follow politics, John Kerry is President Biden's special envoy for the climate. He was Secretary of State, Foreign Minister in effect under President Obama. And he is a direct descendant of John Cabot, who was a Jerseyman, who went to America in about 1500, I think, 1600. And there's a huge family of very eminent descendants of John Cabot. I am, I think, his 12th cousin, second time removed. And I would guess that half of you on the call in Jersey are also related to him. You can actually trace it on my own ancestry page. So it might be we can stimulate rather more people in New Zealand to trace their Jersey origins. I see in the journal that I get a lot about the Irish, but not very much about Jersey. So Keith has done huge work in this respect, but it may be there's more people in New Zealand we can interest, and perhaps some on the call who are not members might join.
Stuart, got your hand up.
Now I'm here.
Yeah,
I just looked up to see how many active members there were in New Zealand, and we have 4.
okay.
I don't think I better tell you who they are over a live link, but I can tell you that they live, one's in Meadowbank, another one's in Mahora. Oh, that's the one lady from Hastings. One from Lower Hutt and one from Wallapawa.
But scope for a bit of marketing, but of course with electronic communication, do you always know where people are from anymore?
Yes, they have to send me their name and address, otherwise they don't get the journal from the society.
Ah, the advantage of the printed material.
Yes.
Okay, we've got a message from Cara Miller, I see, about her sister working at the University of Auckland and encouraging them to join. Okay, many other billows in New Zealand, but not related.
Marie-Louise, do you want to comment on Naya Ockwell?
Sorry, Mary. Can you hear me?
Yes, I read your message. Do you want to comment on?
Right. Okay.
No,
So
Ockwell.
I was just taking it from my book from years ago about Olwyn Whitehouse, but also I seem to remember I did have quite a lot of correspondence with Nari Ockwell, and I just wondered whether Keith knew her or either of the ladies.
Hi, Nari is a good friend of ours. She lives in Dunedin. She was very actively involved around 20, 30 years ago. The Whitehouses I've never met. I've only met them in the online presence. I don't quite remember what their abiding interest in the topic was, but I suspect they still do keep an interest going in that regard. Can I just talk briefly about migration in general? About 4 times the numbers of people who arrived in New Zealand prior to New Zealand to 1900 did actually travel or applied to travel. And so another way of looking at that is it is suggested that only 1/4 remained. Now, the population of New Zealand in 1840 at the advent of European migration was to be measured in just a few thousand. In 1900, it was about 1 million. So the suggestion was that up in that 60 odd years, somewhere around 600,000 or so people were on the move. A lot of them were following gold strikes around the world. And one thing that was said here was when the California gold rush occurred in 1849, the population of Auckland halved, literally overnight, chasing the gold. So people were much more mobile than perhaps we give them credit for. In those days, there were ships coming through from Victoria in Australia en route to California. And by the time they left Auckland, they'd managed to fill them. So generally, in perspective, the Channel Island migration to the Antipodes was a relatively small affair. Professors who've studied the topic of migration in the early days suggested that New Zealand was populated by roughly 1/3 Irish, 1/3 Scottish, and then the rest. So that's me.
Keith, thanks very much for that. In fact, there's a lot of people went to and from New Zealand and Australia, from what I can gather. And indeed, our friend, Mr. John Hellier-Vautier, actually started in Australia and went to New Zealand. And a very prominent artist, John Gillifan, Jerseyman, went the other way. These were among the more prominent people, but as Keith has said, I think people were following the money. And also we tend, as Keith rightly says, we often think about migration as being something that's, you know, a recent event. I've mentioned the Sampsons. The Sampsons themselves were immigrants to Jersey from Trier in Germany. And just looking at my own family, both my mother's and father's side, people were leaving England and Jersey for America, Australia, and South Africa in the 19th century. So this is not at all new. There's been something on the chat from Will Miller, who's got connectivity problems. And he says his great-grandfather's 2 eldest brothers, John and Charles Miller, both went to New Zealand in 1874 on the Tweed. John has left a diary of the voyage, which I have been sent a copy of. And that was the family that then married into the Jarvis family. And somebody I should have sent a note of this meeting to is Justin Lasware in New Zealand. And it seems that quite a few Jersey people who went to New Zealand married other people from Jersey who had migrated to New Zealand. Whether that was pure coincidence, I don't know, but there are several examples of that.
That happened to people emigrating to the Gaspé.
Okay.
The Jersey families intermarried. Yeah.
And Carl Lockwood has asked if anyone has any information on Philippe Georges Jolin, the last person to be hung in Jersey. You're related to him as well. Carl, you don't half pick your ancestors.
Oh, I've got the worst ancestors of the lot. I think I'm probably, no wonder I'm in Australia,
Yeah.
you know.
I wonder if he's in Blampied, Baleine, Volume 1, Marie-Louise. Can you reach for it on your shelf? I can go and get mine.
Well, Marie-Louise has just sent a note. He murdered his father.
That's correct, yeah.
And they lived in Pier Road, probably in the Societe offices.
No, it was opposite. I actually found it. It was a drunken row. That's all I remember. But no, he didn't go to New Zealand, so perhaps we'll talk about that one later.
No, that's fine. Thank you anyway.
Thanks again, Carl. A question from Philippa Kilner, UK. How long did the emigration continue? The Great Surge ended in about 1875 because that's when the free passages stopped. But there was continual immigration after that, but at a much lower level. Again, Keith's database will have all of the records. Going back to Jersey's population generally, on which I have done one book, and it'll be updated next year on the history. Jersey's population in 1851 was 57,000. Jersey's population in 1951, 100 years later, was 57,000. It had, between those 100 years, gone down to as low as about 50,000. So we haven't always had, massive immigration. We've had a lot of immigration since 1951, but there's always been substantial two-way migration. Going back to the 1870s, I think a third of the population of Jersey had not been born in the island. Jersey was importing labourers in the 1830s and 1840s. Fort Regent and St. Catherine's Breakwater were not built by Jersey people. They were built by the Irish to a large extent.
Yes, did everyone catch The Green Dolphin Country by Elizabeth Goudge? Did you catch that reference from Marie-Louise?
It's about a Guernsey.
Yeah.
Immigration, but it's I read it about more than 50 years ago. No, probably 60 years ago. But it's a great story.
Okay, well, we don't talk about Guernsey here. Yeah.
Can I just intercede here and say that in respect of families marrying, that was quite common, partly to do with sponsorship, I think. And Jean Hellier was typical himself. He travelled halfway across the country to find and bring back a fellow countryman. He married a girl by the surname of Tuay. He found her in New Plymouth, but had subsequently travelled from Napier to Nelson, which would probably be several hundred miles, to bring her back as a bride. But subsequent to that, as he became more prominent in his community, he was, I believe, sponsoring families to come to New Zealand. And in fact, I have on record one family where, for reasons unknown, they sent their 6 daughters, and that was the Robert family. And I believe that John Hellier was given the task of finding homes for them or marrying them off. It's not a topic I've researched deeply, but I have met a few descendants of that family.
Thanks, Keith. I do cover that in the paper, thanks to your research. There was a great deal of sponsorship in this way. And there was a man, Philip Dobell, a prominent Jerseyman who travelled to and from New Zealand, who actually started discussions with the New Zealand authorities about bringing a shipload of people from Jersey to New Zealand. He was describing they were going to be the entrepreneurs and wealthy people bringing capital with them. I just say it didn't actually happen, but there was talk of this happening. But yes, there was sponsorship, and indeed, I think I'm right in saying that the free passage then was available to sort of friends and relatives. People could nominate other people for it. But although once people got to New Zealand, from what I gather, they very seldom stayed where they landed. They very quickly moved somewhere else in New Zealand to where the work was. I actually travelled to the port of Lyttelton, which is the port of Christchurch, which I discovered, I wouldn't say is nowhere near Christchurch, but it's quite away from Christchurch through very hilly country. And I think they landed in Lyttelton, and then they would simply go where the jobs were.
Regarding the migration boom of the early 70s, New Zealand government sent a guy to Britain to borrow £10 million to effectively populate the country. And his name was Julius Vogel. He was a member of the New Zealand Parliament. And I suspect that apart from the fact that the free traffic was stopped abruptly in 1875, that the money had possibly run out, or they decided the emphasis had to change. I haven't actually researched that.
That's right. They said they had a big operation run by Mr. Bogle, who then either before or after was the equivalent of the Chancellor, I believe, in New Zealand. But it was a major effort to increase the population of New Zealand. And the marketing operation was supported by the agricultural unions in England, because I think they saw this as an opportunity for agricultural labourers at a time when conditions were not great in England to improve themselves by going to New Zealand. There are some books which I refer to in my paper about the emigration generally, not specifically on Jersey. And they hardly mention Jersey. So in the greater scheme of this immigration, although the numbers were high in relation to the Jersey population, they were not particularly high in relation to the total number of immigrants. Okay, any more questions or discussion? In which case, I think I hand back to the chair.
Yes, if everyone's happy that I wrap this up. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Most interesting. And I gather that if you've got more research to do, more burrowing, you think you've reached the limit?
I've reached the limit on this. I'm doing
Yes.
other things, but reached the limit
Yes.
on this one. But there's scope for other people, I think, to do more research. I've only covered part of New Zealand, and there's work to be done in Australia, equally interesting.
Oh, yes. Yes, yeah. Mm. Mm. Well, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you everyone who's contributed your questions and your observations. And so, John, are you ready to wrap this up?
Well, I can cut everybody off at a stroke if you like, but I think if we finish, we can just wave and everybody can back out gracefully.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
And those in New Zealand can go back to bed.
Yes, yes, and greetings
Yes.
to you all from Jersey.
Thank you for the invite. Thank you.
All
Thank you
right.
so much. We're going to
Bye,
have
everyone.
breakfast.
I'm going back to bed. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheerio.
Right, I'm going to leave.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.